Hello again, everybody. Lovely to see everybody. Right, we're going to have the next part of our story. Last week, we heard about the time when a man called Saul, who lived with his dad called Kish, had gone to look for some donkeys because they got lost. Do you remember that story? The donkeys had got lost and his dad had sent Saul and his servant to go and look for the donkeys. And they didn't find the donkeys, did they? But they did meet Samuel the prophet. And Samuel did something very special to Saul, if you remember. Do you remember what he did? He told him that God had chosen him to be the first king of Israel. And he poured something on his head. Do you remember what it was? He poured oil on his head, not black oil like Mummy uses when she's cooking, yellowy oil. He poured that on his head, and that was called anointing. And it was a way to show that this person was going to be set aside to do a special job. Right, so Saul had been told that he was going to be king. We didn't expect it, did he? He was really shocked when Samuel told him. And if you remember, a few weeks ago when we were doing this part of the story again, we learnt that the people had decided they wanted a king like all the other nations, even though God had been their king. And so, a little while after Samuel had anointed Saul, Saul went back home, and Samuel called all the people in Israel to a place called Mizpah. And so here we can see Samuel and all the people have come together. And so when Samuel brought them together, he said, right, you have all said that you want a king like the other nations, even though God is your king. God brought you out of Egypt. Remember that story that we learned? God brought them out of Egypt and they went through the Red Sea with the waters at the side. And God brought them through the wilderness. And Samuel reminded them of that. God has been your king. God has been your leader. But they still wanted to have a king of their own. And so Samuel said, okay, so God has chosen somebody from the tribes of Israel to be your king. And so he said, if you remember, we've done in the past, there were 12 tribes in Israel. And each tribe was the name of one of Jacob's sons, if you remember. And so Samuel said, okay, the tribe that this person is going to be called from is from the tribe of Benjamin. Now that tribe was quite small. And so the tribe of Benjamin all were in one place. And they thought, wonder who it is. Now within the tribe of Benjamin, he said it's the family of Matri. Oh, right, okay. So all the other families knew it wasn't anybody from their family. And from Matri, it was going to be one of the descendants, and his name was Kish. And if you remember, that was Saul's dad, wasn't it? So he said from the family of Kish, so it was Kish's just little family left. And Samuel said to the people, God has chosen Saul from the family of Kish. And the people said, great, wonderful. They all started looking around. So, where's Saul? Anybody seen Saul? Where's Saul? Now then, do you remember me telling you last week that Saul was either very tall or very little? Can you remember what I said he was? Well, what I said was that Saul was tall. That's a good way to remember it, isn't it? Tall Saul. Saul was so tall that when he stood in a crowd, all the crowd would come to hear, and his head would be higher than the rest of them. So they all looked round and they thought, well, where's Saul? And they would have seen him straight away because he was so tall. And nobody could find him. They didn't know where he was. But God knew where he was, didn't he? And God said to Samuel in his mind, Saul is hiding behind the bags. Let's have a look at the picture. Here we can see all the bags that the people had brought with them because they travelled a long way. Here's all the baggage, look, and here's Saul hiding behind them. Do you think he felt a bit nervous about becoming king? I'm sure he did. I'm sure he felt nervous. And God said to Samuel, go and get Saul from behind the baggage. And so the people went over and they brought Saul back. And Samuel said to them, here is your king. And I'm sure he put a crown on his head. Here is your king. And the people shouted, long live the king. Long live the king. So if we look here now, we'll see here's Saul with the crown on his head. Look, gold crown on his head. And so Saul became the first king of Israel. And Samuel had said to him that God would give him a heart to rule. That means he'd give him understanding and help him to rule the people. And so God had chosen Saul out of all the people to be the leader. Even though the people had rejected God, God chose him as their leader. And so God does put leaders in place. Not all leaders love God, unfortunately. In some countries, the leaders are not very nice people. When we think of our leaders, when we think of the leaders of the country, the leader of our country is Queen Elizabeth, isn't it? Queen Elizabeth. And I brought this book today because when she was 90, this book was brought out. And can you see what it says? It says, the servant queen and the king she serves. Oh, the servant queen and the king that she serves. Even though she's queen, our queen knows that there is a God who is higher than she is, and she serves God. And on the back here of the book, it says something that she said. I know just how much I rely on my faith to guide me through the good times and the bad, and to put my trust in God. I draw strength from the message of hope in the Christian gospel. And so, just as the people would have prayed for Saul, who was their leader, we should pray for our queen, that God will guide her and give her wisdom. And it's lovely to see that she acknowledges God and puts her faith in God and trusts in God. And so our colouring sheet tells us to obey our leaders. Obey our leaders. That means that when we live our lives, we're to obey the laws of the land. We're not to be people who break the laws. We're to obey God's laws and we're to obey the laws of the land. And so just after this now, there's just going to be a very, very short little video that's going to remind us of the story about Saul becoming king. And then you'll be able to do your leaflets and do your colouring sheets. And I hope you enjoy that. And I'll see you next week.
A week later, Samuel called out all the tribes and leaders. Then Saul's tribe was called. But where could he be? Saul was scared, and his heart was not eager to take responsibility. Samuel called out to the crowd.
Look who I bring. See who God has chosen to be your king. God has given you what you asked. I will tell him of his duties, responsibilities, and tasks.
The people were happy, and they began to sing. The people shouted,
Long live the king!
Saul was no longer scared and his heart was eager. He was ready to be Israel's leader.